Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here this evening. My name is Eleanor Harvey. I'm the senior curator of 19th century American art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, but my background switched from geology to art history with an emphasis on landscape as a way of conveying human emotion and ideas, and so I jumped at the chance to introduce and participate in this program this evening. I'd like to welcome you all to the Nantucker McAvoy Auditorium at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. We are webcasting this presentation this evening, so I have one housekeeping request, which is, would you do me the favor, now that we have wireless throughout the building, take your cell phone or anything else that makes adorable noises or that lights up, and please keep it from doing those things, because trust me, in the dark, we can all see your screens. So with that in mind, what I'd like to do is introduce the program and the first of our speakers this evening. The occasion we're celebrating right now is an exhibition that is on view at the Renwick Gallery, our satellite museum across the street from the White House. And the exhibition, Infinite Place, the ceramic art of Wayne Higby. If you've not yet seen the book, trust me, it is a fabulous read, and it has gorgeous photographs of the works in the exhibition, and I encourage all of you to take plenty of time in order to be able to absorb what Wayne has accomplished in each of these pieces. Wayne Higby, I probably don't need to tell you this, is an internationally acclaimed ceramic artist and an inspiring teacher. His work is housed in museums and private collections around the globe, notably in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and the Museum of Modern Art in Tokyo, and here. He's professor and the Robert C. Turner Chair of Ceramic Art at the New York State College of Ceramics at Alfred University, where he has taught since 1973. He's written eloquently on ceramics and their history, and his essays, lectures, and criticism mark him as an accomplished scholar as well as an artist. The awards that he's received are numerous, notably among them the Master of Media Award and the Distinguished Educator Award from the James Renwick Alliance here with the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and the Museum of Arts and Design in New York's Visionary Award. Since 1991, he has also traveled and taught extensively in China, and in 2004 was named the first foreign national to achieve the status of honorary citizen of Jingdozhen, known as the Porcelain City of the World. I'd like to introduce him, too, in a more personal note, because I have looked forward to meeting him since the mid-1980s. My very first collection was contemporary ceramics because it was a medium I never mastered, and therefore I coveted and admired the works of those people who had figured out how to use it as a most eloquent form of visual expression. I first encountered his work in 1986 in the gallery and home of Helen Drutt English, who wrote for the catalog, had a gallery, the Helen Drutt Gallery, which was one of the groundbreaking decorative arts and contemporary craft galleries in the United States. And I stayed at her home in Philadelphia, which was a fabulous experience, but also extremely nerve-wracking. I was afraid to get up in the middle of the night to get a glass of water, lest I knock something over, as there were ceramics on every horizontal surface in the place. Wayne's work was, needless to say, well represented. But when I first saw his landscape-inspired bowls and lidded jar canyons, I saw someone who fundamentally understood landscape as a vehicle for enlightenment. His own artist statement bears out that thinking, and I repeat it for you here. Earth, sky, time, light, space. My work is a meditation on the relationship between mind and matter. It is not about landscape. And that tails back to the origins of landscape painting in this country, from Emerson's transparent eyeball being able to literally hover over the landscape and encompass all of its fullness, to Thoreau's declaration that a frontier is wherever a man fronts a fact. They both developed philosophies that emanated from the great German naturalist Alexander von Humboldt, whose approach to the relationship between the natural sciences and the human mind take us from earth into atmosphere, into the realm of the soul. Wayne Higby's works are made from the elements of the earth, geological in their origins and in their aspirations, but they are also vessels, and vessels encourage us to navigate uncharted waters, to be daring, and to understand the relationship between form, function, and functionality. Humboldt's belief that landscape was not a topographical limning of a specific place, but was a vehicle for a state of mind, a springboard that, in his words, moves us beyond the mysterious boundary which connects the metaphysical with the physical and leads us into another, higher sphere of ideas. Wayne Higby has accomplished this in clay, in his writings, and in the way that he views his art in the world. Will you please join me in giving a warm welcome to Wayne Higby?
Oh my, well, all my expectations have already been fulfilled. I have really been looking forward to this moment. I had not thought about myself being here on this stage talking about my work, but I had been looking forward to hearing Eleanor and Henry talk and admiring, as I do, their scholarship and deep interest in things that I'm also interested in. I thought, what a lovely evening that would be, just to sit somewhere here in the back, kind of pull a hat over my head and try to be inconspicuous and just listen to these two amazing scholars talk about the American landscape and what it means and what it's meant historically. Your introduction was already just a choice piece. I'm an artist, and I'm not a scholar. I have done my best to study, but I'm mostly, passionate about being in the studio. So I'm making things. And I always tell my students, and generally get to this point with an audience when I'm talking about my work, that everything I have said or everything I'm about to say is something I made up after I made the work. And I think that's kind of apropos of the way artists tend to work. You have these thoughts, you have these feelings, and you do your best to sort of try to bring them forward to sort of see that sense of the I am and to question it, to try to understand your experience. Last week I gave a lecture at school at Alfred University about my work, and it was somewhat lengthy, but the title of that lecture is called Light Falling on Grass. And that brought a few people across campus just to the auditorium to say, what's he going to talk about? He's going to talk about light falling on grass? I hope the lecture isn't as boring as just watching grass grow. But there was some confusion about what we were going to do with this talk. But I started the talk simply by saying, my mother, when I was a child, when I was a youngster, she would always ask me, what are you thinking? I don't know, maybe you've had other people ask you that question. It's a very obvious, simple question. And I would always say, nothing. And then she would admonish me. She'd say, you can't be thinking nothing. And I'd say, oh, okay. And I'd think, I don't think I'm thinking anything. Why can't I just not be thinking? And over time, I began to realize that, right, I wasn't thinking. Not the way she thought you were supposed to be thinking. I was watching light falling on grass. And by that I learned that I spent a lot of time just looking. And I was talking to Henry earlier trying to explain this. I had a piece of paper which has my notes on it for this talk. And I was just looking at it. And the bright light from up here was shining on it. And it was so bright. And I was sitting there just looking at this bright piece of white paper. I thought, right, I'm not thinking. I'm just watching light falling on a white piece of paper. So that's kind of where it starts for me in terms of that sense of the artist. It's something in the world, the phenomenology of the world, the light, the landscape. I grew up in the West. I'm originally from Colorado Springs. And one of the great features of Colorado Springs is not especially me, but this big rock is on the summit of Pikes Peak. And this is a mountain that's quite famous in American history. And it's there. Colorado Springs is sort of built at the foot of Pikes Peak. And where I grew up was on the other side of the valley across from the mountain. And I lived in a home that had a big looking out window. So I grew up kind of just looking at Pikes Peak and at that landscape. And then, of course, I lived in it. I had a horse. I rode a lot in the landscape. So those were very formative years that just became deeply embedded in my psyche. This particular photograph is from this summer. I took my grandchildren. They had not been to the top of Pikes Peak. So I gathered them up and drove them to the top of Pikes Peak so that they would have that experience that is so important to my own childhood. And this is an early piece. It's called White Mesa. It was made in about 1975. And it seems appropriate to just read a version of my artist statement, an earlier version, one that's quite a bit earlier than the one that Eleanor read you. I think over time your artist statement, well, mine got shorter and shorter as I sort of began to distill it. But originally, I'd say this one was written about the time that this piece was made. It says, open and expansive, the landscape of America has for generations reflected the promise of a new world. Celebrated by artists, the panorama of American nature has been transformed into a symbol of diversity and the spirit of opportunity. From sublime vistas to the intimacy of gentle pastures, the American landscape inspires longing and hope. My ceramic work has become an extension of the tradition of American landscape art. By process, it is nature herself, earth, water, and fire, teamed to bring forth mysteries of place. All of these pieces that I'm sharing with you right now are in the exhibition. This is another earlier piece from the 70s. I called these bowls, but they were kind of built from the idea of a box, essentially without a lid. And almost all of this early work was done in earthenware through a process that's referred to as raku. And this is a Japanese process, or at least its origins are in 15th century Japan. But essentially, the way I would do it is to fire the piece to temperature, has glaze on it. When the glaze becomes molten, remove it from the kiln, wrap it in damp hay as a kind of combustible, which would then create a sort of shift and patterning of the color across the surface. And what interests me so much about that was developing this feeling of light moving across the landscape. So I began over time to develop this process and to develop a particular glaze that you see in all my work that actually has never existed in ceramic history before I started using it. This is a piece called Return to White Mesa. Beginning in the 70s, late 70s, I started to investigate this idea of the bowl, and that investigation was sort of embedded in this notion that one could kind of sum up, or not necessarily sum up, but sort of arrive at a certain essence about pottery form, and that this kind of sign or symbol of human ingenuity, the tool, the way mankind has swept up the earth and transformed it into objects of utility, into objects of consciousness, and objects that reflect what it means to be a human being. And I thought, well, the bowl it's a kind of quintessential object. And it grows from a small base and opens up, and there's a tremendous volume, and this dialogue is also present between inside and outside. The bowl is a very figurative object because it certainly reflects not only that sense of human consciousness in terms of how materials can be transformed into purpose, but also reflects a kind of portraiture of the human. And we talk about pots as having lips and shoulders and necks and feet. So I was very interested in trying to create an object that would be iconic in some way and address those issues. And to cancel, for just intellectual purposes and philosophical purposes, the more practical side of function. And by inducing an image on the outside and the inside would be a way to ask questions about the nature of inside and outside, and to cancel the questions of function, because obviously if you put magazines in it, you've pretty much canceled the way the art works. The other thing was, following along what you've all done, I'm sure, is just to take a walk in the woods or take a walk on the beach. And when you walk on the beach, or certainly when I walk on the beach, I tend to look down. I gather maybe things, maybe a stone, maybe a shell, and from time to time I would turn and look up and see the horizon and see the whole panoramic kind of move into a kind of pictorial image. And then I'd move and turn and walk again. Bowl was another sort of site where when you transverse it, if you go to the museum and look at these things, my feeling was, well, this is a little like walking on the beach. You walk around it, you look at it closely, you step back, it opens up. There's a bit of a kind of panoramic image that locks into place in some cases, and then you keep moving. So that was, in one sense, the way I was trying to technically engender the image onto the bowl. This series went on until about the 1990s, and this is a piece called Midsummer's Bay, and it was made in 1990. This last series, I began to try to use glaze to give an object a time of day. So sometimes you will find a bowl from this series where the rim is painted black and the blue glaze is very bright to sort of give it a feeling of night, but maybe moonlight. This was an effort to kind of engender a sort of time like midday, like at noon when the light is just high. So the idea of sort of playing with glaze and using the qualities of the material to also empower the work with a certain sense of time of day, was another interest of mine. And to take things just one step further, and this may be something also about this question of the bowl and its figurative presence. I'm going to read you just a brief quote from a book that's been very important to me. It's a book by a gentleman named David Abrams. The title of the book is The Spell of the Sensuous. In his groundbreaking book, The Spell of the Sensuist, ecologist, philosopher David Abram writes, "The mind is not something otherworldly essence. The mind is not some otherworldly essence that comes to house itself inside our physiology. Rather, the mind is induced by the tensions and participations between the human body and the animate earth. Intelligence is not ours alone, but is a property of the earth. We are in it, of it, immersed in its depths." Another series was a series of what I just called boxes, but the shapes were kind of arrived at by looking at canyons and the cliffs along the walls of canyons and trying to abstract that just into a kind of folded shape, and then to reintroduce the idea of the panorama on top of that shape. They started out as 4 units, and some of them went to 5. I think there may have been 1 or 2 that had 6 units. This is the other side of this piece. It's called Yellow Rock Falls. And this is a piece that's in the show. It's actually owned by the Smithsonian. I'm not sure you can tell from here, but partway down, almost halfway down, you'll see a darker line running across the middle of the piece. That's an indication of where the top comes off. So the top part actually comes off, and so there's space there then inside. And that's always been a part of my work, this idea of the pot, again, what it means. And I never had an idea necessarily of what you would put in there. I did make a box once for sand from Canyon de Chelly, from the creek bed of Canyon de Chelly. But I like the idea that it's there, and that if you owned it in your home, you might have that intimate kind of experience with it. So you see it like you see the landscape, you come up, you have a closer connection to the landscape, you touch it, maybe it's like picking up a rock, you move it, you look more deeply into it. So the sort of events associated with the landscape, from the vista to the more intimate sense of touch, were all something that I wanted to try to embed in the work. Often critics would ask in their prose about the work, is Wayne Higby a painter? Is Wayne Higby a sculptor? Or is Wayne Higby a potter? And I thought, well, do I have to choose? I'm not choosing. I think of it as sculpture. I think of it as pottery. I think of it as painting. And I used to kid my friends in other media. I said, the whole art game started with pottery. They took those paintings off those pots and hung them on the wall, closed up the opening and got a sculpture. But the pots were really the origin of the artistic universe. So I think I probably still feel that way. I don't, well, I'm broadcasting it now, but maybe it's slightly tongue-in-cheek. But it's an advocacy position, obviously. And the last couple of slides that I want to share with you have to do with what the arc of my work has evolved into. For the last 10 or 12 years, I've been doing very large architectural installations. And I still feel that the root of these pieces is embedded in the idea of pottery and the things that I've shared with you, certainly the idea of the landscape. I recently completed a piece called Earth Cloud, and it's in two buildings that kind of face each other on a plaza. It's the Performing Arts Complex at Alfred University. And I was invited by the patron, a gentleman named Marlon Miller, to create a piece for the inside of these two buildings. And I worked with architects called Cowman, McKinley & Wood from Boston to create this piece. There are 12,000 hand-cut porcelain elements, and it covers about 6,000 square feet. But as I mentioned, there are two buildings that face each other. So part of it is in the building you see on your left, and you go in and down the steps and through that space, and then you come up through another set of steps into the other building. And there's a great deal of glass, so there's a tremendous amount of reflection, and the piece multiplies at different levels. So my feeling about putting 40,000 pounds of clay on the wall, 40,000 pounds of porcelain, was also to cut it in a patterns that when light hit it, it would break it up and cast shadows and lift it. So it would become then atmospheric, and you would have this sense of the earth, the sense of the hand, and then this sense of the rising sort of ephemera, the infinite place of the cloud, this question, an idea that the cloud houses, which I think of in terms of the word impermanence, so that the whole installation is a bit of a meditation on impermanence. But one thing, of course, you can see is that the architectural setting replicates the bowl. And it is, at scale, very much connected to my idea about the bowl that you saw there in the first few slides. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wayne. I really appreciate your giving us some insight into the way that your approach as an artist has developed. I agree with you. Having to nail yourself down to any one discipline would make the best of us twitch. And so the idea of breaking boundaries, of being able to be more than the sum of your parts, is something that I think clearly comes through. Our next speaker this evening is Dr. Henry Sayre. He's a distinguished professor of art history at Oregon State University, where he's taught since 1983. He holds a bachelor's from Stanford University and a doctorate from the University of Washington. And before coming to Oregon State, he taught at Wake Forest in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Not surprisingly, he has won numerous teaching awards from Oregon State. And in 1997, he completed production of a multimedia teaching packet for art appreciation that was funded by an impressive $1.2 million grant from the Annenberg Foundation at the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. That multimedia teaching packet included a 10-part TV series that first went on view in 1997. He has written 6 books and articles that have been published in journals worldwide. His work tends to focus on the interrelationships between the fine arts, performance, and installations, and his emphasis on landscape painting in his essay in the catalog for Wayne Higby makes him the perfect scholar to bring that multifaceted perspective to bear on Wayne Higby's art. So will you please join me in welcoming Dr. Henry Sayre.
Thank you, Eleanor. And I just want to begin by saying what an honor it is to not only be here, but to be able to say something about Wayne in Wayne's presence. His work is work I admire. Well, maybe you'll get some sense of how much I admire it in this talk, but I've known it for years, and I'm just honored to be here. Several years ago, I found myself standing on the rim above Summer Lake in Lake County, Oregon, where more or less on this same spot, more than 150 years ago, on December 16, 1843, the explorer John C. Fremont had stood. At our feet, he wrote, more than 1,000 feet below, we looked into a green prairie country in which a beautiful lake, some 20 miles in length, was spread along the foot of the mountain. Shivering on snow 3 feet deep and stiffening in a cold north wind, we exclaimed at once that the names of Summer Lake and Winter Rim should be applied to these proximate places of such sudden and violent contrast. Now, as Fremont and his men prepared to descend out of the snow and into the warmer basin below, he recognized for the first time that he was looking out, in his words, over a great interior basin, a succession of lakes and rivers which have no outlet to the sea, and which has the Wasatch and Bear River Mountains for its eastern and the Sierra Nevada for its western rim, and the edge of which we had first entered at the Great Salt Lake. He was perched, in other words, on the rim of a great container. Standing in this same spot 150 years later, I had been struck by Fremont's perspicacity, by the breadth of imagination it must have required to recognize the parameters of so mammoth and vast a landscape. And I remember thinking to myself that Fremont, at that moment, before most Americans had even begun imaginatively to comprehend the vast scale of the territories that lay to the west of the Rocky Mountains, that he had turned the idea of the American sublime upside down. The symbolic language of the sublime dominates American landscape imagery, and it is usually associated with elevation and altitude, with peaks, pinnacles, and spires. For the painters of the Hudson River School, whose vocabulary was more or less determined by Thomas Cole in the 1820s and 30s, mountain scenery provoked intimations of infinity and thus of deity and the divine. And those are Barbara Novak's words. And for Cole, particularly the qualities of immensity, limitlessness, and awe that mountain scenery provoked were significantly amplified by light. Cole called sky the soul of all scenery. It is the sky, he wrote in his essay on American scenery, published in the American Monthly Magazine in January 1836, that makes the earth so lovely at sunrise and so splendid at sunset. In the one, it breathes over the earth the crystal ether, and in the other, the liquid gold. No one paid closer attention to Cole's thinking than his only pupil, Frederick Edwin Church, whose two paintings I've used to illustrate Cole's ideas about light and sky here. The sky raises the eye, and in the sublime rhetoric of the Hudson River painters, the soul, heavenward. Thus, even when Cole finds himself perched high above a valley, like Fremont, overlooking the Great Basin, as here, on the escarpment of the Catskills, looking down over the Hudson, the painting's energy, its attention, does not rest on the distant valley, but on the wildness of the surrounding heights. And in this, arguably the most famous of all Cole's works, the Connecticut River Valley below, is merely the passive counterpoint to the wild sky and scenery of the heights in which he has, in fact, famously immersed himself. Let me approach this in a different way, by comparing Fremont's understanding of the vast western interior of the United States as a container to the point of view of two paintings in the collection here in this museum by Albert Bierstadt. This one, Sunrise in the Sierras, painted on site near Lone Pine, California in the Owens Valley in 1872, when Bierstadt was accompanying the Clarence King 40th parallel survey. And Bierstadt's point of view is a point slightly south of this photograph. The second, this one, was painted among the Sierra Nevada, California. Was painted by Bierstadt in his studio in Rome, Italy, in 1868. The first is a factual sketch, the second, a complete fiction, a sort of synthesis of Yosemite on the left and the Dolomites, the Italian Alps, on the right. And both of these Bierstadts essentially translate the vocabulary of the Hudson River Sublime to the west. The eye rises, in this case, from an elevation of 3,727 feet in the Owens Valley to the wholly sublime elevation, in this case, some 10,776 feet, just over 2 miles, to the top of Mount Whitney, which at 14,505 feet is the highest point in the contiguous United States. At dawn, Bierstadt bathes the scene in an almost transcendent light. In order to evoke the feelings of awe that he felt before the spectacle of the Sierra Nevada, Bierstadt resorts here to a Baroque sense of drama, to a play of light and dark worthy of Caravaggio, the stormy heights contrasting with the mirror-like quietude of the lake below, the reflection of the waterfall and cliffs in the lake serving to underscore the verticality of the composition. In fact, Bierstadt employed this basic, overwhelmingly vertical compositional scheme in painting after painting throughout his career. Water rolls down from a ring of usually imaginary vertical peaks into bowls filled with mountain lakes. And if the central mountain in this painting bears almost no resemblance to the actual Lander's Peak, Bierstadt's peak more closely resembles the Matterhorn, which in fact he often painted. At least the central peak in this painting bears a passing resemblance to Mount Whitney. But by and large, Bierstadt's views, this is a painting of Mount Corcoran, and this is the actual scene, are what might best be called exaggerations. And even when the size of a Bierstadt painting is modest, this is 13 by 16 inches, and if you've ever been to Lake Tahoe, you don't recognize this. As opposed to 6 by 10 feet, the scale is still enormous. Now, standing on the winter rim above Summer Lake got me to thinking about these things, about how for Fremont, the Sierra Nevada were not so much an elevation before which one stood in awe, but in his words, the western rim of a great basin. How their height had not interested Fremont so much as their circumference and diameter that they helped to define. It was as if Fremont was asking us to turn our attention away from peaks above and concentrate instead on the quiet lake filling the basin below. And so a couple of years ago, when Peter Held called me from the Arizona State Art Museum and asked if I might be interested in placing Wayne Higby's work in the context of American landscape painting, the opportunity catalyzed a train of thought that I'd been pursuing off and on for some time. And it had occurred to me that rather than the symbolic language of the sublime usually associated with altitude, with peaks, pinnacles, spires, and buttes, that there's a second language, more domestic, and thus not so obviously sublime, but equally pervasive, the language of containers and the vocabulary of ceramics. Basin is one of these words, and not just the Great Basin, but other basins across the West, like the Columbia Basin, and this is Loveland Basin ski area in Colorado. A somewhat smaller version of the basin is a bowl, the back bowls at Vail, or the bowls behind Lake Louise in Canada. And of course, the edge of both a basin and a bowl is a rim, the Mogollon Rim in northern Arizona, and the north and south rims of the Grand Canyon. I'll return to this painting a little later. There are more specialized kinds of containers like cauldron. This is the Devil's Cauldron in Oregon, and Cauldron Lake in Alberta, Canada. And because I won't have time to talk about it later, I can't help but compare this photograph to Wayne Higby's Pictorial Lake. There's pots. Teapot Dome in Green River, Wyoming. This is an old postcard. The handle disappeared in 1930 and the spout in 1962. The Teapot and Sugar Bowl Formation, also in Green River. The mud pots and paint pots of Yellowstone. And the Ganagohalege, which means the place of the clean pot in the Mohawk language. And finally, there's a certain vocabulary taken directly from ceramics. Slab, this is Satan's slab, one of the flatirons above Boulder, Colorado. And in ceramics, of course, slab construction. Hollow, as in both Sleepy Hollow and the myriad other hollows around the country, and there must be 5,000. And in ceramics, of course, hollowware. Plate, as in the plate tectonics that inform the elasticity of the Earth's crust, and the related word plateau from the French trait. And of course, finally, crater, from the Greek crater with a K, a mixing bowl. Now, I'd like to suggest that this vocabulary of containment is a way for the imagination to grapple with what it knows exceeds it. To contain, that is, what is larger than itself. Standing on the winter rim above Summer Lake, Fremont called the Great Lake Depression before him, the Great Inland Depression before him, the limits of which he could not begin to fathom, a basin in order to define its shape and conceptualize its dimensions. He was standing in a spot analogous to the figure in this painting by Fitzhenry Lane. I grew up calling him Fitzhugh Lane, but they found a document in 2004 changing Hugh to Henry. I like Hugh. A bay is, of course, something of a container in its own right, and a figure whose vision stretches far beyond the scene before him, out to sea, embracing something of the imaginative scope, I think, of Ishmael, who in the opening pages of Moby Dick reminds us that, as everyone knows, meditation and water are wedded forever. Or as Barbara Novak has described this figure, he meditates inwardly and the landscape meditates through him. He seems a function of a single idea, embracing water, rock, figure, twig, absorbed in a transcendental vision. Now, this painting is an example of the other form of American landscape painting, bathed in a quiet light rather than caught up in the drama of storm and cloud, horizontal rather than vertical in orientation, its surface smooth, almost crystalline, like porcelain, rather than turbulent with brush and paint. And Novak named this style, with John Wilmerding, luminism. And in his catalog essay for the Infinite Place exhibition, which draws us all together tonight, Wayne Higby admits being partial to the luminous. Fitzhugh Lane, John F. Kinsett, Martin Johnson Heed in particular. The horizon line always beckons, Higby writes. I've introduced it repeatedly into the work. Perhaps one can slip through the razor's, still Higby, perhaps one can slip through the razor's edge of line and float free in a world of all-embracing awareness. I engage landscape, he writes, as a panoramic outer membrane of an inner manifestation of unity, a silent, unseen, unknowable resonance of coherence. Now, perhaps because Novak recognized in luminous painting a tendency toward the panoramic, their horizontal expanses, she writes, suggest a lack of accents at the lateral edges, that they are plucked away from a more, and suggest that they are plucked away from a more extensive panoramic view. We have been slow to recognize the rhetoric of containment that luminism embraces. It is as if, uncontained at both left and right by their frame, they are endlessly expansive. But a panorama, lest we forget, is a 360-degree view. It is round, like a bowl. And looking at a luminous painting is something akin to looking at Higby's bowls from one side. You have to experience them in the round. That said, a work like Painted Rocks Canyon seems cut from a more panoramic expanse, just as this view of the Grand Canyon by William Henry Holmes, who in 1920 became the first director of the National Gallery of Art, which is today this very Smithsonian American Art Museum, might appear spliced from the much more expansive view of his panorama from Point Sublime. Holmes's panorama is the luminous equivalent of Thomas Moran's Chasm of the Colorado, the grand opera of its earth and sky, light and dark, overwhelming our sense of the canyon as container. It is rather to the luminous that Higby's great panorama, Earth Cloud, turns. Composed, as he already told you, of 12,000 porcelain tiles layered in strata onto metal brackets, it circumscribes the lobby walls of both the Miller Performing Arts Center and the Miller Theater at Alfred University, like the geological strata of the Grand Canyon itself. As it contains the lobby and the space between them, it contains us. In Higby's own words, we are of the earth, yet we are also of the transcendent, the purely imaged possibility of mind. At once real, grounded, but as well as free to move deeply into imaginary realms, he says, we are Earth Cloud. And so I would suggest was John C. Fremont, that cold December day, standing on the winter rim, looking out over the Great Basin. He was, that day, Earth Cloud. Thank you.
You stay up here. Go over there. Wayne, I'm going to coax you back out of the audience up here on stage. And at this point, we can raise the house lights and blacken the screen behind us. Otherwise, you may end up getting rabbit ears. And what I'd like to do now is open this up to a conversation between Henry and Wayne. I will interject only as I need to, and as I said before, hope to become absolutely superfluous.
It's kind of move around, don't they?
Yeah, you can roll them around too, and see where the conversation takes us. These are cool. Wow.
Yeah, they are.
No, this is the first time
We could
I've
have
had
we could
these.
have we could have a bit of a game up here.
Yeah, we could actually, couldn't we? Wow, this is dangerous. I like this. Wayne, I know that you've remarked on it, and Henry has made it really clear that 19th century American landscape painting has exerted a rather profound and sustained influence over the way you see the world and the way you see your work fitting into it. One of the things that I guess most interests me about that is that as an art historian who has had to fight for the relevancy of 19th century American art in a contemporary world, it's gratifying to see that interest fast forwarded into the world of contemporary ceramics. But my question for you really is, at the time that your work began to encompass the landscape, and then you began to do your lidded structural elements that form canyons, you were sort of breaking through the kind of luminist paradigm into a more sublime space, but you were also breaking a lot of the rules of ceramics. You were divorcing form from function. You were, in fact, giving back the idea of painting sculpture and clay simultaneously. And for those of us who are coming up to speed on all of this, can you talk a little bit about how that felt when you first started conceiving works that didn't follow the rules?
I don't think I knew what the rules were. Maybe that was the
Did we create the rules after the fact?
You know, I don't know. I had something I needed to do, I guess, with the work, and I just pursued that. I know at the time my work, in terms of what was going on in contemporary ceramics, was odd. And For one thing, I think a lot of contemporary ceramics, and we're talking now when I first started working in clay in the late 60s. I graduated from Boulder in 65, and I had discovered clay just prior to that. It was a stoneware world, and most ceramic work at that time was kind of a stoneware and stoneware pottery kind of tradition, based in what was then called, and I think we refer to it today as the studio craft movement, or studio pottery movement. Partly, I think there was some interest in moving into stoneware, maybe even porcelain, in the sense of moving clay away from what had been the American craft, the American, the movement associated with art pottery. So I think art pottery was an interesting phase of ceramics, but I think it was something that contemporary potters of my era were kind of just trying to sort of ignore in some way. And moving into porcelain, moving into the individual being the total producer, maker, mixing their own clay, and there wasn't a great deal of color, because at that temperature there generally isn't a great deal of color. I was interested in the painting and in the paintings, and I needed to search for color. I liked the choreography of clay. I liked being physical in the studio and moving around through space and lifting and pushing and all of that, the physical touch of that, which is what drew me to ceramics from painting, because I was a painting major as an undergrad. So I turned to looking at earthenware color and earthenware materials. And I began to just make these little shapes and boxes, and I don't know, I remember early one, putting a cloud on it was very, very awkward, funny, almost pop kind of. But not long ago, there was a big show from the Archie Bray Foundation, and this show traveled around the country, and there were a lot of players, and my mentors and some of folks of my generation. And as I walked through that show, I was looking at pretty much what I described to you, the stoneware pot, the stoneware vessel. And then there was this little piece with a little vitrine over it, and it had green and blue and this little sort of finial with a cloud. And I thought, this looks really odd in the context of this work. So it was just different at the time. And I don't know, I think probably I just, I didn't know how to make anything else. I didn't know why I would make anything else. And yet I was always very uncomfortable, because I felt that my work didn't quite adhere to what it was supposed to be adhering to. I don't think that answers your question very well, but that's
No, actually,
a little piece of history.
It does. I know that you've made the comment, and it certainly bears out, that it only seems obvious in retrospect. After you've gotten there, does the journey seem to sort of fall into place? That as you're doing it, you're not 100% sure what you're doing, or except that you feel compelled to do it.
Yeah.
And that's the way it ends up coming together.
My first encounter with pottery, of course, because I'm from Colorado, as we've all established, but my first encounter was pretty much with American Indian pottery, which is all earthenware with painted patterns and things. And the Colorado Springs Fine Arts Center in my hometown had a great, wonderful collection of American Indian pots. And I remember registering that, but not thinking too much about pottery. But then in '63, I took a trip around the world, and in the course of that journey, I wound up at a museum called the Heraklion Museum, which is on Crete. And it's an ethnographic museum that's just full of Minoan pottery, which is just absolutely extraordinary. And that was an epiphany walking into that museum and seeing that work. And I had kept a journal, and I still had that entry in my journal. The particular day I was there, what I saw, what I wrote. And I said, when I return to school, I must find out about pottery. I must meet someone who knows something about pottery. So it was always an earthenware world for me. And so that kind of energy in connection with landscape and other things just stayed with me. And I was just determined to pursue my own feelings about that. It did occur to me, from time to time that it was, kind of, one thing is to make pots, the other thing is to paint landscape on pots. And this was not really the going thing at the time.
No.
But even today, I think when I talk about my passion of American painting of the 19th century, my colleagues are sometimes like, what? What's he looking at? Because it doesn't perhaps seem to be part of the more edgy contemporary consciousness about work.
And yet the way we feel about landscape is fundamental to who we are as Americans.
It's so American, it's so fundamental to what we think and feel as human beings.
Yeah.
And that spirit resonance in the work, and Henry touching on that through the luminous and all, it's just been really, really central to my being and my sense of what it means to be a human being in the world. Yeah.
I should say, one of the things that we share is we both grew up in Colorado, and I grew up in Boulder, and Wayne grew up in Colorado Springs, and I grew up in a house that was up on the side of Flagstaff, and so I grew up looking out on the plains, and Wayne grew up out east of Pikes Peak, looking back at Pikes Peak. Our window looked out to the flatness, and he looked up to the edge. And I grew up above, right up the hill from Woodman's studio. So I would, my mother used to buy little hanging Mary Woodman flower pots because she was interested in somehow getting nature into the there's some strange thing about growing up in the West, and feeling and being able to walk out your door and climb a mountain and looking out all over every place.
Strange or fabulous?
Oh.
It's fabulous.
Well,
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah, strange too. I mean, it gives you
Make that clear.
because I think Wayne grew up an only child, and I grew up, leaving the house every day in the summer and saying, I'll be back at 6 p.m. And that was it.
I think perhaps for me, when I'd have to lie down on a couch and you'd ask me more personal questions, but growing up an only child probably has something to do with my connection to that sense of the landscape. There's this very famous painting by Caspar Friedrich where he's standing on this rock and he's
Yes.
looking out, and it's just the single person, or the single person in the heat sort of looking into the bay.
Into the bay.
And I think, I always think, well, that's me. Looking for connection, feeling, I didn't ever feel particularly lonely, but I felt alone, and I felt that nature was some kind of nurturer, some kind of voice, some kind of connection.
Well, one of the landscape painters, Sanford Gifford, who was a good friend of both Kensett and Heed, was close friends with Candace Wheeler, who became a very important interior designer at the end of the 19th century, but she also hosted a utopian community in upstate New York, Oneonta,
Yeah.
and her mantra was, when we touch ground, all mean worries disappear.
Yeah.
And it was that idea that in an increasingly fast-paced industrial world of 1880s New York, that one needed to get out into the woods, to be by yourself, to feel surrounded by nature in order to reground that sense of mind and spirit out in the landscape.
Yeah, yeah. See, I just think, of course, well, that's the touchstone. I mean, it's so, for me, it's so critical today. You know, I think about making something that's strong, something that's powerful, but something that's serene.
Yeah.
And do those two things connect somehow? Earth Cloud to me has maybe a piece that I've gotten close to. There is an element of serenity for me in the way that the space finally achieves itself. But there's also a feeling of power in it that you feel that's in the earth, in the landscape.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference in the way that porcelain operates as a medium for you and the earlier stoneware and earthenware? Because it fires at a different temperature, it's glazed differently, it conveys light differently. And so I'm curious to know, as you began shifting from one medium to the other, what you felt about both the appeal of moving into porcelain, but also what it does that the others don't.
I think there are two things about porcelain for me. One was the way it receives light, and whether it's glazed, not glazed, or just fired. Very interested in how it receives light. And some of the parts of Earthclad are sandblasted, very matte. Some of them are shiny. But also, it's a very fine particle material. And the fineness of that particle and a block, and I turned my studio into a little folk art brick factory. So I was just making blocks of this very finely grained material. And at a certain dryness, it's still wet, but it's really firmed up. And just cutting it with a sharpened paint scraper. The whole piece was cut with one tool, the paint scraper, that I kept sharpened on a little grinding machine. And just going, and this is the greatest thing that ever happened on for anybody. And when I started with doing this with porcelain, I just thought, this is so great. I just love doing this. How can I figure out how to do this all day long? It seems,
12,000 pieces.
It's meditative. It was just the fineness. You would cut through that surface, and then the parts that I cut off, I would stick back on. And gradually, this thing kind of became something. But the stoneware has more of a tooth, and it's it's a great material because it's very practical. It's very strong when it's fired. But the material is also not. It's not as receptive to your fingerprint as that fine porcelain, and it's not as receptive to light, essentially, when it's finished. And earthenware, I love earthenware. I've done very little work in stoneware. But earthenware to me was like dirt. It was more like the earth. And just being able to grab that earth and shape it. And the immediacy of what I did with the fire, being sort of present in the fire, that was the exciting thing about earthenware. And I think also because it was my entry into ceramics.
Can I ask you about Earthcloud and about the shards and the shapes? Because it seems to me when that jaggedness is about light, right? And about shadow and catching light. Yeah,
Absolutely.
that's to me the magical thing about that piece is.
There were 7 different textures, so I cut.
There's the gold.
That's another one. But I cut them some big shapes, and then long shapes, and then smaller chunky shapes, and shapes like this, and then shapes like this. And all of that was a way to capture light in different ways, and for light to sort of cast shadows, so that you could have this massive sense of material and this feeling of weight, but then the light and the patterns would keep shifting and moving. So gradually the piece gains a certain atmospheric effect and seems to sort of float slightly. And then I did in the second half of the piece, I added the gold to it. So, you had the gold. That was like, yeah, you showed the church. That's the dawn and the sunset and the light coming, between the clouds and stretching across the face of the lobby of the building. It's real gold too.
Well, expect nothing.
We would expect
It's-
that, right?
It's probably less valuable than copper, though.
Yeah.
Real gold in a glaze matrix.
Do you enjoy working on that scale?
Yeah, I did enjoy it, but the problem, a little bit, it's not a problem, it was exciting, but you also, in a project like that, the artist becomes a project manager. And as a project manager, you're dealing with a lot of complexities, and also you're worried about, the finite, intimate moment and the sort of the global kind of how are we doing with the budget and how many people do we have and is the construction crew coming today and the scaffolding isn't right and so it's more like I thought I really enjoyed collaborative work and during the midst of that I was thinking this is more like being a movie director or something. Where you have a concept and you know what it's supposed to look like, but you need a cameraman and you need a crew and you need a light person and then you need the players, and then they all begin to tell you what it is you're doing. And so if you have to kind of allow for that. I think if you work in ceramics, that's a good education because ceramics always tells you, what you're doing. It doesn't always behave. So you have to follow it, and things happen, something falls on the floor and you go, I could use that. So I think when you're working on a big project like that, and I had people helping me at different times, watching them do things and listening to them and watching things come together was a way of sort of following it and also a way of them telling me what it was I was doing, which was fun.
Do you have a sense of where that piece is leading you?
Not really. I'm right now. I'm in the midst of going back into the studio and trying to make something about this big. I'm trying to rediscover that more intimate moment with it. But I have been talking with some people who would like me to do a large installation in China, and we visited some big marble quarries not far from Beijing. So
Okay.
I don't know what that means.
Well, it probably
Stay
doesn't.
tuned.
It probably doesn't mean black.
No, it's just like, I don't know.
But you could have something. Are you working small scale in porcelain, or are you back in
In
earthenware?
porcelain.
In porcelain.
Yeah.
Okay. Have you ever worked on a small scale in porcelain, or were you just?
The pieces,
Aggregating.
there are a series of pieces in the exhibition
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
are called tile sculpture. They're about this size, and that's where the porcelains really started.
Those are interesting too, because it seemed to me when I was looking at some of your memory pieces from
Yes.
like Powell, that the bas-relief design, if you will, or the falling raindrops or the others that are glazed in celadon, that it's as much an essay in drawing as it is in sculpting, and that in titling them memory and having them in such a gloriously translucent, monochromatic thing, it really was like looking at a memory instead of the real thing. There's a sense of distance and distillation and a springboard into something bigger than what you actually got in the
Yeah,
tile.
that's what happened also when the glaze kind of came down over things and things cracked and they sort of became more obscured. I said, oh, I can't quite see it.
Actually,
So
they
it's
reminded
kind
me of, and I was going to put this in, but I didn't have time. They reminded me of Timothy O'Sullivan's photographs of the Grand Canyon.
Yeah.
Because with the aperture that he had, the water turns into that kind of
Molten.
just motion glaze, and they just reminded me completely of those black and white photographs.
Those pieces got started because you mentioned China, and I've been doing a lot of work there. never made a piece there, but until I did make one big piece there, which you could see part of that in the exhibition. I took a journey one day when I was in Jingtachan to Galen Mountain. And Galen Mountain is basically a mountain of kaolin, and it's this white clay. This is the clay that afforded the Chinese to be able to invent porcelain. And Galen Mountain is, it was about a 6-hour drive. Now it's probably a 2-hour drive from Jingtachan. And I took a chunk out of the kaolin mine and put it in my pocket. And then when I got it to my studio, I made a little shrine for it, and I put it there, and I said, okay, now I can work in porcelain. So then I got some porcelain, and I thought, what do you do with porcelain? So I decided at that point that I was going to be, not smart ceramic person. And I just made a thick 8 or 10-inch chunk of it and fired it up, and it blew up.
Exploded.
And then, and then I glazed the parts, and I went, rocks, very nice. And so those pieces just kind of evolved out of not knowing what to do with porcelain.
Okay.
But that's a pretty good description of how I work.
That's actually really helpful when you think about it.
But, I'm missing the conversation between the two of you.
I don't think the
No,
conversation.
I'm talking to it.
No.
What question would you ask?
Neither one of us is interested in anything but you, so there.
We could yak on about landscape painting and take this up to the 30,000-foot level and leave the audience far behind, but I don't
I
think
like that Bierstadt was painting the Matterhorn.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he painted, at least, I found about, 7 or 8 different versions of the Matterhorn. And he painted it almost to the year he died. Because he could sell them, I think.
Well, not only that, but
Yeah.
he's painting the impact that it has. I mean, the painting that we have upstairs on the second floor in the Sierra Nevada, the one painted in Rome, which is Yosemite on one side and the Alps on the other, is basically as much as I have been stuck in a wagon train with the same people for 3 months. We have managed to cross the Great Plains and not die in the process. And now I'm sitting here at the Front Range going, how on earth do we get over this? Because I'm not going back. We're not doing that again. And so even the elk seem sort of mesmerized by the verticality. And, Clarence King, who was a friend of his, would turn on him eventually and say his mountains would fall over in a good stiff breeze because they're too tall to be realistic. But it wasn't about realism.
Right.
It was about what impact did this have on you. And it's a little bit like having something blow up and then seeing something else in it that gets you excited. And what he was looking for is what excites me about this landscape.
That's why he liked Yosemite so much. I mean, he could hardly exaggerate it. It was just such a crazy place.
It's like the statement, my little provocative short sentence at the end of my statement.
Yeah.
Artist is not
It's
about
not about
landscape.
the landscape.
And that always, it's purposely there to sort of provoke the question. But I think you both sort of were so concise, and we just immediately went there. Of course it's not about landscape. It's about all of these other ideas. And
It's
we
landscape
forget
as
that
a
because we
vehicle.
get caught up in the picture.
Well, it's a little bit like clay as a vehicle for getting to a higher set of ideas, and the landscape is a visual vocabulary that then takes you there.
Right.
But it's not about the topography, it's really about what you do with it.
Landscape just initiates the imagination. It just gets the imagination going. And always had, growing up with driving my kids around the West, drove me crazy because I would say, look at that, look at that. And the kids, had their earphones on and would never look at anything. But I can't imagine that.
I swerve at road cuts, it
Yeah.
drives them crazy. If you drive from here over the Hagerstown Pike into West Virginia, there's a place called Sidling Hill where the landscape has been rather deeply tortured. The metamorphic, literally, it falls back on itself. It's like the oxbow
wow.
turned up on its side, and they actually have a visitor center to keep you from driving off the road. So that you will actually stop, get up into a little observation deck and look at it from a safe distance rather than careening at 55 miles an hour around a hairpin turn. which is kind of them, I think. But the idea of getting excited by something you see in the landscape that triggers a bigger response.
Well, and I love this story, but Beardstock was painting this particular scene in his studio in Rome.
I know. I mean, it really
And I
is.
thought, well, of course, because, you know, it's not about painting the picture. He's like, he's there.
Yeah.
You know, he's remembering it. He's painting
part
the
of who he is.
feeling, and then he's having a nice glass of wine and some pasta.
And, you know, I really think it's Cortina on the right, but I couldn't find a good enough picture to prove that. But,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. But the luminous were always, I think, you know, there's another thing in the Kensit and the luminous, and I guess I want to just say the word silence.
Mm.
And there's something that I've always been interested in my own work about, a quality of silence, or kind of a silent coherence. And maybe that comes from also being only child, not having a lot of, you know, conversation all the time, but being quiet, silent, experiencing space. But they're very still.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that stillness was always something that was haunting to me. In the Kensit with the horizon and the waters, ripply, very reflective, but the whole sense of the painting is a stillness.
You know,
It's
the
magical.
boxes, the landscape boxes, could be said to contain silence.
Ah, that's nice.
It's better than pencils.
Yeah. Well, and Kensit is also taking
thought
landscape in a more abstract
Yeah,
direction.
yeah.
Sort of the antithesis of Bierstadt. It's what Barbara Novak used to call the grand opera and the small still
Right.
voice. It's that notion of you have this whole spectrum with which to work, and one has to find one's place on that spectrum and shift it and move it as the muse takes you.
I did enjoy the way my work was presented in the Renwick Gallery, and
Mhm.
I had a nice moment with it. As everyone knows, it didn't open in this way it was sort of originally meant to open. But it did afford me an interesting opportunity, because I had come back at another point just by myself, and very quietly at the end of the day walked in to look at the work. And I spent maybe an hour looking at my own work. And I don't think, you know, had I come to the opening or other times, I would have had that same opportunity. Maybe I would have come back and done that. But it really became more urgent for me to come back and just walk around and look at the work. And I think one thing that happens at the Renwick is that they were able to capture this sense of the expansiveness of the work, and how I think about this idea of the kind of containment, but the expansiveness of the imaginative component. But also the way it's lit and the way it's housed in this bit of a journey. I think you get some sense of the intimacy of being with the work. And it has, for me, it had this, it had a meditative quality that I think is something that I've always, you know, been a part of in terms of engendering the work. And maybe silence kind of brought that up to me, but just that sense of its presence, but its serenity, maybe its energy. But I think the installation there, and I know Robin is here, I think, I'm sure you had something to do with that. I thank you so much, because I think you really captured something that I feel about the work, and you never know whether, you know, it's been communicated or not.
It got to me. I'll tell you, I was so glad that I had returned to White Mesa,
Yeah.
because where it's situated in the room by itself on that one pedestal is almost iconic. I mean, it's really, and then the three other bowls in the next room, in the middle of the room, so that you can get completely around them. I felt it was, I was there this morning, and there maybe were 5 other people, And it's a beautiful installation.
Yeah, I enjoyed that.
Yeah.
It seemed to capture, and maybe also because there's a busy city going on outside,
Yeah.
and so you can walk in and there's a moment that just like exhale and enjoy that sense of
Well, the pieces feel as though they convey oasis.
oasis.
You sort of feel as though you have arrived someplace where the rest of the world falls away.
Oh, that's great.
And I know that when you were showing slides of Lake Louise, having had the privilege of being there, even when it's an incredibly crowded summer afternoon, there is something magical enough about powerful landscapes that you can suddenly feel as though you are the only person there. And the nice thing about this installation, but it carries through almost everywhere I've seen your work installed. I remember seeing the piece in Minneapolis and just running across it alone in a room on a pedestal in a vitrine and just stopped in my tracks because it has that ability to make everything else just simply fade away and go silent. And so I wondered when I first saw this installation whether that was the magic of one piece or whether it could be sustained throughout that kind of dialogue. And I was actually pleased to see that the pieces are able to speak individually, but there are kind of murmurs in between them, where if you listen closely enough, you feel like you can pick up on a little bit of the dialogue. But it does remind me, as much of anything else, it really is Kensett and Lane, because there is this sense that you can hear a pin drop.
Yeah.
And that you're the only person out there, even though there's activity going on around you.
Yeah, great.
So it's certainly a great pleasure from that standpoint, too. We have a few minutes for questions from the audience. We do not have microphones tonight, so if you are interested in asking a question, if you will say it, give me the opportunity to repeat it for posterity, and it will also give these two gentlemen a chance to think about an answer. Yes?
How do you two gentlemen know one another, for how long, and how have you influenced one another?
Okay, the question is, how long have you two gentlemen known each other? What were the circumstances of your meeting, and what reciprocal influence you might see on each other's work?
We met each other at the opening for the exhibition, actually after Wayne's talk at the opening for the exhibition at Arizona State, just not even a year ago. I'd known his work for a long time. I sort of identified with his work and with the photography of Robert Adams, who also grew up on the Front Range of Colorado. And so the curator, Peter Held, was my student. So that's how that all happened. But it was really a great thing for me to finally get to meet Wayne.
You know, Peter and I had this conversation. It seemed as though when we were writing the catalog or preparing the catalog for the book, that some essay, we didn't know what it would be, but something needed to be there that dealt with American landscape and American landscape art and all of that. And Peter said, "Oh, I know someone I think could do that." And then he mentioned Henry's name, and I said, well, we should try to contact him. And then I picked up a few things Henry had written, and I thought, I don't know whether you can talk this man into dealing with my stuff. That would be kind of amazing. And then I really met Henry when I read the essay, because I hadn't, of course, talked with him a minute. And as the essay unfolds, I just was overwhelmed. I thought, this is so perfect. How did this come about, you know? And he just, this idea, the connections that he brought here this evening to share with us, and the connection to ceramic. And I think this really, for me, of course, very beautiful notion of that lake and this other notion of the sublime in the way the earth holds a space.
Yeah.
Was something that, you know, these are things that you think about, you don't know that anyone else is thinking about these things. And then I'm reading this essay, and I thought, this is just an extraordinary essay. What an opportunity to have that connected up with my book, up with, and being able to see that in the work. Because artists, we work, we don't know quite what we're doing. We hope for connections. We hope the feelings are being communicated. Often you don't know, and sometimes you don't feel that they are. And when I read that essay, I just thought he gets it so, and he can communicate so beautifully, that I was just really overjoyed with having that text in the book.
And let me say, if you haven't seen the book is one of the most beautifully produced books that I have ever been associated with. It is just gorgeous.
It can be incredibly difficult to render in 3 dimensions without flattening things out or without being able to find the right angle in order to make a 3-dimensional piece take shape and resonate. And I think that photography in this catalog is one of its strongest
I did the book
communicators.
with an art publisher, a small art publisher in Stuttgart, Germany. And I had done a previous book with them called Earth Cloud. So I knew them, and I knew the kind of work they could do. And they're just the best. And it's small so that I could be present and sit down with the designer and just have an all-afternoon conversation about my ideas about the work. And the next day she came back with typeface and a color and a sense, and I went, yes, exactly. And working with them on the book, they were so amenable to my ideas and for me to be collaborator in developing the book. So that sense of space that you feel in the book was something that was very important to me. So it has an openness and a kind of spatial dimension. It's not just one picture stacked on top of another one. They did a beautiful job. I was very, very happy.
Got a question over here?
In the exhibition, there are sketches that you've done before executing a piece. Could you talk a little bit about how you conceive a piece and what you do before you touch the clay?
The question is, there are sketches that are installed as part of the installation, and what role they play in your conceptualizing of a piece, and what process do you go through before you actually put hands on clay?
I've always drawn a lot. And so the sketches are just something that, it's just part of the practice. It continually goes on. I'm doing a whole series of cloud drawings now. And they are not necessarily directly preparatory to the work, but they are kind of getting one into the zone, a kind of sense of trying to conjure a quality or a feeling of some sort. And drawing is very important to me. I think a lot with drawing. Sometimes there are pieces that are directly related to drawing, where I'll make a sketch and I'll look at the sketch and then I'll make something from that called what I call a schematic, which is not a blueprint, but might be a more kind of tactical strategy, because when you're thinking about how you might make something in 3 dimensions, you might want to sort of sketch it out and work it out. There are 2 drawings in the show of box pieces right in that first gallery, and they're more strategic. They were sort of trying to see how I could create that cliff-like folded shape, but where I would introduce image and how I would introduce the top and the bottom. So they were kind of working drawings a little bit. The clouds are not working drawings. Other drawings in this show are, they were a lot of things that came out of spending about 10 days on Lake Powell, where I just drew every day and filled 2 or 3 sketchbooks full of drawings. And then those things became the basis for a lot of other just loose brush kind of drawings. And from there, I made the drawings on plaster that make up the big tile, the porcelain tile. And in that case, I had taken a kind of a lot of the drawings of the Lake Powell and just sort of borrowed from different ones, senses of space or position. And then I drew in pencil on slabs of plaster. And then I cut those lines into the plaster.
Okay.
So that when you press the porcelain in, you would raise the porcelain up, and then the lines would be in 3 dimensions.
Gotcha.
Which meant that they would capture light, they would cast a shadow, and they would catch glaze. And that's, I just had this idea that it would be an interesting kind of surface rather than the line being embedded, but for it to be raised. And that gave it a little more dimension or physicality. There was a series of things then that happened, which really are rubbings, and I put paper down on top of that plaster that had the negative line, and then I rubbed, charcoal on those. So all the lines on those drawings are white, but they're and I thought this rubbing thing would be interesting because there would be a sense of touch on the paper of the hand. There's one of those in the show. It's in the long space on the far left where the porcelains are. It's called Silence.
Yeah.
And it's just a very delicate little rubbing of the surface of one of those plaster. But drawing is just always going on. And so it cooks the ideas. So then I just go in the studio and start banging around. And things happen gradually.
I should say his cloud drawings are phenomenal. They remind me actually, and I really mean this, of Leonardo's storm drawings. They really do.
Well, they're fun to do.
He didn't do any porcelain, so you're okay.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm going to take a stack of drawing paper and my easel and all of those drawings are actually done with a Mont Blanc fountain pen, and just holding the end of the fountain pen like this and just letting it move, while I was sort of going clown or something, and playing with that. So there's stacks of those, and the pressure or nod or holding the pen in a different way, just trying to make the mark. And gradually trying to give it a voluminous feeling and a depth. It's really fun to do.
Does the ink go through to the next sheet?
No.
When you okay.
Very cool. I think we have time for one more question. Yes?
Not sure I heard the whole question. But were you asking about the influence China may have had on the work? Yes. Well, I was Chinese in a previous life. I discovered that. I went to China for the first time in 1990. I was invited to this first conference on ceramic art. And it's quite a large audience. Maybe 300 or 400 people. At that time, mostly gentlemen in Mao suits. Was not that long ago. I stood at the podium and just showed pictures of my work. I didn't try to say much about it because I was afraid the translation would be too awkward. And I just began showing pictures of the work, some of the things you saw tonight. And there was a great turmoil in the audience. And I thought, what are they doing? They're not paying attention. But they all started talking to each other, and then they started coming down to the front of the auditorium and taking pictures of my work. And there was this immediate kind of connection that had to do, I don't know exactly, but with the landscape, with this quality in the work that also I think seemed fresh, seemed different, but also connected with some traditions in Chinese painting and landscape, which is very, very important in Chinese culture and Chinese art. And from then on, it was just an evolving process where I went back, and I've been going back now ever since then, so it's over 20 years. maybe 3 or 4 times a year. I finally made a piece in China, and I started a program in China in connection with the Central Academy of Fine Arts. We have a big studio there, and I have, there are about 40 undergrad Chinese students studying ceramics, and a few exchange students from Alfred. But one of the big clues that came to me from talking to a lot of different people in China when I give my presentations is often afterwards the question would be about Buddhism or Taoism.
Yeah.
And I didn't know much about Buddhism or Taoism. So I started to study, and I found very important and very deep, influential connections in both of those ideals, those philosophies, and particularly in Buddhism. And the last big piece, the last 2 big pieces, one big piece that's a waterfall, and it was purposely chosen because a waterfall is a meditation on impermanence in Buddhism, and the cloud, which is also similar kind of meditative image. And those were strong connections for me through what I have studied relative to Buddhism that my Chinese friends kind of put me onto. They saw in the work. And I realized after I began to look more deeply into that, that in fact, the work was connecting to me very strongly in ways that I began to understand, that I didn't have as concrete a framework for beforehand. And then, of course, the great epiphany was to realize that there's a strong quality of that Buddhist ideal in transcendental thought in American 19th century landscape painting. So it came full circle for me.
Yeah, I should say, if you wanted to illustrate, or to write about Wayne's work, probably some Chinese poetry.
I read a lot of Chinese poetry.
Yeah, is the closest it comes.
I read a lot of Chinese poetry.
Which is interesting, because your description of the cloud drawings reminded me of northern and southern Sung landscape painting in China, and the notion of how that calligraphic brushwork ends up both abstracting the forms and then forging reality out of abstraction, and that it's very much a dynamic interface.
And the
one
process
and the
that I
other.
described is something that I adopted from my study of that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great question, thank you. China's been so important to me. Amazing culture, so extraordinary. And my friends and artists I've met, and we don't often, we're not often able to communicate fluently, but we're artists, so we communicate quite well, I think.
Well, Wayne, thank you very much for
Thank
communicating
you.
so eloquently here tonight. And Henry, thank you for framing his work and his career. I hope all of you will make the trek back over to the Renwick, even if you've seen the exhibition many times. I know this will open your eyes to a different way of viewing it. Do avail yourself of the opportunity to get the book. The holidays are coming. It's an excellent excuse to pamper yourself or someone else. And again, thank you so much for coming
Thank you.
this evening.
Thank you.